conducting research and teaching, absolutely fantastic. And I think it's wonderful. So I'll see how much of this material I'll be able to go over. I think I'll provide you with many of the highlights. I want to give you the background because I always think it's kind of interesting, to hear how people got interested in operations research and networks. I'll discuss our approach to supply chains and the disruptions that we've suffered at the height of the COVID pandemic. I'll also bring into consideration various disasters and how they have and continue to affect international agricultural trade. Then I'd like to present in greater detail a multi-commodity, the international trade network model, which we actually constructed with colleagues in Ukraine. And based on that, I'll also discuss like a performance indicator. How do we know how well the network is performing, which are the most important nodes and links and so on, and also talk about robustness measurement. And I will conclude with talking about how we deal with the media, legislators, and so forth, because I think it's very important that we get the news out about the research that we're doing in order to affect positive change. I think that's critical. Okay, so I'll share some insights and so on. And I will be talking about tariffs, sorry, but that's the reality. So background and motivation. I love working on network systems. That's always been my true passion, beginning with work on congested urban transportation networks to supply chains, as Dr. Awashdi mentioned, also internet and integration of social networks with financial networks, as well as with supply chain networks. But I would say last, 15, 20 years, we've been focusing very, very heavily on supply chain networks. And I think one of the reasons is the students love the applications. There are so many relevant applications, okay, which are fascinating. Okay, I'll talk a little bit about food supply chains. There are all sorts of applications in healthcare and also in disaster management, as well as in high tech and even toys. And toys are now being affected because of the huge tariffs that US has imposed on China, and they have retaliated. So the trade wars continue, sadly. So these are some of my books. A lot of times my books will have the word network in the title. One of the greatest compliments I find is when I will hear from a professor in another country that, oh, I got one of your books and the student scooped it, okay, which I think is really, really nice. But in the case of the fragile networks, it actually got hacked and copies published around the world, okay? So sometimes it's not good when the books get scooped, okay? So what about the background? Okay, do you remember like the first course that you ever took in operations research? Do you remember the professors that inspired you? Well, we had a visiting professor from England that was teaching an operations research course, and I just absolutely fell in love with it, okay? And after I finished my undergraduate degrees, and I had actually two, I worked for the Naval Underwater Systems Center in Newport, Rhode Island, which is absolutely beautiful. Within 5 days, okay, I learned how to program in assembly language code, ANUYK assembler, which was something. And then, as a 22-year-old, I was writing code that US submariners could use to avoid the enemy. So essentially, it was a transportation problem in 3 dimensions, okay, because, they could be detected by sonar and so forth, and how to do that. And it was used, okay, so I thought that was fantastic, and also really, really, and it also helps that I know a lot of languages, and I even studied Russian. Okay, so while working for the high-tech defense sector in a beautiful location, Newport, Rhode Island is absolutely stunning, running marathons and so forth, I decided I don't really like having a boss. I was having projects assigned, okay, that were like 3-year projects, but I would finish them in 3 months In operations research, we like to be efficient, right? We like to finish projects on time. So they would say, "Oh, Anna, you're too efficient." I say, "Why is that bad? Give me more work," and so forth. So I matriculated into the master's program at Brown, and I think I was the only student that was, working full time, commuting, and, competing with the other master's students. And I had heard about Stella DeFermos actually from my undergraduate roommate, who was a prima ballerina from Chile, who had escaped Chile, for example, the Stella DeFermos. Okay. So she was the only female in either applied math or engineering, and they counted her twice. Okay. So she also needed someone who was good at coding. So I became her first PhD student. And Stella was truly an inspiration. She was phenomenal. But sadly, she passed away at the age 49 of cancer. And she's one of the very few who have been honored with a tribute in operations research. I wrote the obituary in honor of her. So, and I think it's available for free. Okay. She was only the second female PhD in the US to have received a doctorate in operations research, and that was at Johns Hopkins. Johns Hopkins at the time had phenomenal faculty and students, faculty like George Namhauser, for example. Another fellow student of hers was a colleague was Judith Liebman. Okay, so, and through Stella, one of my former PhD students produced through the academic genealogy that you can do. Okay, North Dakota does this, my academic family tree. So you can see that here I have Stella DeFermos, my name, and this hangs in my office. It's framed to inspire my students. Then it goes to Maxwell, from Maxwell's equations. And then look at this. We go all the way from Newton and Galileo. Okay, so this is pretty phenomenal. In operations research, we're really standing on the shoulders of giants, which I think is really, really exciting. And it also shows how important, interdisciplinary research is in our field. So our approach to all sorts of supply chain problems is definitely interdisciplinary, probably more multidisciplinary. We do a lot of work on perishable supply chains and also time-sensitive supply chains where you need knowledge and expertise from like physics, chemistry, biology, and medicine, okay, to capture the perishability of various products, such as blood, okay, which is perishable, red blood cells, platelets, and so on. Medical nucleotides, which are used in cancer diagnostics, also cardiac issue diagnostics, and also pharmaceuticals and food. Those are all perishable products, as well as vaccines. So we enjoy that. We do a lot of collaboration and so forth to get the right skill set. I mean, we have a lot of these skills, but it's always nice to collaborate. So I truly believe that networks are very powerful formalism for visualizing a lot of important problems, including supply chain problems. And this is something which I think decision makers and policymakers also appreciate, okay? Because you can say, oh, look, this is, for example, a pharmaceutical supply chain where you have multiple firms, each having its own supply chain in terms of production, transportation, storage, and dissemination, right? Last mile dissemination to retailers and so on. And you can then say, oh, what happens if a node is removed? What happens if a link is removed? What if you change the data? And so on. And this, interestingly enough, is a kind of blood supply chain for the American Red Cross, which we've been working with. And we find that absolutely fascinating application, okay? And many of these problems that we work on, they're not pure flow network problems, they're generalized network flow problems, because depending on whether it's blood or vaccines or medicines, the amount of flow will typically decrease as it goes down a particular link. And this is an example of a medical nucleotide supply chain. Okay, and it's really, really interesting. There's even a Canadian connection because of the Ottawa nuclear power plant, which, is very old and so forth. I think it was shut down. I'm not sure if it was brought up. So there are many challenges in the sector. And when we started working on this and published a few papers, we were even contacted by the OECD in France and saying, how can you be working on this? Well, we are. It's very important. And we did, I think, the first models in terms of medical nuclear supply chains. So related to that, and especially like food and so forth, I think is also the issue of quality. And I think that's never been more important. What we're seeing in the US now, for example, there are major cutbacks in terms of the layoff of employees in various federal departments, from the CDC, from the Food and Drug Administration. It goes on, National Institutes of Health, and so on. So that is going to be affecting, I think, quality of food and many different kinds of products. But even over time, we've had horrible cases of, for example, adulterated infant formula in the US. We've had, for example, shortages of baby formula. You've probably heard of the Takata exploding airbags, exploding ignition switches, and so on. So, and I think one of the most horrific things was, in the pandemic, when we needed those PPEs so desperately, our national stockpile in the US they had PPEs, but they had all expired. So you see, they're perishable. You don't usually think of facial masks and so forth as being related to food, but they do have expiration days. So it was a waste. They hadn't checked, they hadn't, resupplied and so on. And that was bad. Okay. So when we deal with, quality competition in products, you have to consider like different tiers, for example, because maybe something would happen in terms of freight transportation, maybe in terms of, manufacturing and so on. And then, also within that context, and I think it's very important now with all these different supply chain disruptions, how do we know which is the most important supplier? And now in terms of, tariffs and so forth, that's becoming even more important, right? As the automotive supply chain in North America gets challenged and many other supply chains. So in the COVID pandemic, I mentioned already, the major shortages that we had in terms of PPEs, in, cleaning supplies and so forth. And amazingly, some of these challenges continue, but for different reasons. We're now dealing with all sorts of geopolitical risk, right? Heightened geopolitical risk, wars, violence, and very sadly, increasing strife and unrest. So I truly believe that the tools of operations research have never been needed more than now. That's something extremely important. We need to harness, our powerful tools of mathematical analysis, computing, and so forth, for, not only, predictive analytics, prescriptive analytics, but also for policy evaluation and innovations. And very, very much into that, and I'll show you why. So what about food supply chains? I think we've all had a nourishing breakfast, so we're not hungry. Last Friday, actually 2 Fridays ago, I gave a talk at the University of Louisville in Kentucky in person, and my talk was noon to 1, and I think a lot of the students, they were hungry and they were smelling the pizza outside. Okay, we had a delicious lunch afterwards. So here we've marked recently the 5th anniversary of the declaration of the COVID pandemic, okay, by the World Health Organization, right? March 11, 2020. And I remember right around that time, I was supposed to speak at the University of Toronto, okay? And I was seeing what was happening and so forth. And I said, I don't think I should go. I think my talk was right around, the 12th or 13th. So I actually canceled it. So if you Google it, it's like canceled. Okay. There's a good reason, there's a pandemic. I thought, I don't think I would have been able to get back probably either, but that could have been not so bad. Okay. So we began focusing on fresh produce supply chains in the context of like oligopolistic competition over 10 years ago. And it was a paper that was published with a former PhD student of mine, now a tenured professor in Oregon, Min Yu. okay, on competitive food supply chain networks with application to fresh produce. Now, it was published in the European Journal of Operational Research, and it had this kind of typology. So we could have alternative production sites, shipments, right? You could have different refrigeration levels and so forth in terms of preserving the quality of the fresh produce processing, maybe additional storage and ultimate distribution. And the firms would compete, okay, with one another, and consumers would respond, okay, kind of to the quality and also the prices that they were willing to pay. So we really liked that work. And in fact, it was recognized by the editors of EJOR at a Euro conference in Poznan, Poland. Also, one of my favorite conferences. The pierogies were amazing there, as one of the most significant papers published in the EJOR over the last 5 years in that period of time. So then we went further, and with a PhD student of mine, who's a professor now at the University of Richmond, Danish Basic, who's a foodie, we started working on farmers markets and also taking formulas from food scientists, which I think is super cool. When it comes to fresh produce, it's amazing that they have modeled actually scientifically quality deterioration of, like, strawberries, cantaloupe, spinach, and so on, and also bananas, based on, the temperature, the humidity, and so forth, and the time. Okay, so we worked on local farmers markets, trying to show what would happen and where should they be actually selling over time, over the week, the produce that they've been growing. So we were working on apples because we have lots of apple orchards in Western Massachusetts. So that was integration of food science in a rigorous way into agricultural supply chains, okay, which I thought was really neat. And then also we went further, and in another paper in the European Journal of Operational Research, we included another tier in terms of processors, and we worked on minimally processed agricultural products. So you think of, the little carrots that you might get, okay, in the supermarket, cut up cantaloupe, and so on. And so consumers would respond to the fresh produce from the farmers and or to the produce that's minimally processed. And that could also be frozen. And we could then recover the prices and so on. And we use, again, those food science kind of formula to see what would happen. Okay, and we would measure the times that it would take across the different links, the various conditions, and so on. So then what struck me, and I'm sure you in the pandemic, was, the importance of numerous essential workers and farmers, right? Freight service workers, healthcare workers, of course, and educators as well. And we could see that so much of the fresh produce was rotting in the fields. The meat processing plants couldn't keep up, with the processing of the chickens and the cattle and so on. And farmers were suffering, it was horrible. And we had all sorts of shortages when it came to meat and produce. So what struck me is, what we need to be doing is focusing more on, human resources in the context of supply chains. It's not just a matter of manufacturing widgets and so forth. Labor is a critical resource. So we began working on integrating labor in supply chain networks, okay, using a lot of ideas from economics in terms of wages and productivity and so on. And I wrote an article, for example, in ORMS Today saying, in the end, it's all about the people. And I think the OR community was fantastic during the pandemic in having, for example, virtual seminars that brought us together, all sorts of virtual meetings that they were extremely, extremely important. So the first paper that I wrote on perishable food supply chain networks and labor was published in a book that I co-edited on dynamics of disasters. And it was an optimization model. It wasn't a game theory model. So you had essentially a fresh food farm. It could be, for example, like farmers, different production sites and so forth. And they could be, for example, selling directly, because we could see in our area, all these farmers were starting like farm stands, for example, and you can pay via PayPal or Venmo. And that was wonderful because you could get fresh produce, they could sell more of it. And it provided you with an activity, a safe activity because it was outside in the pandemic. And we found that, lack of labor, even in one supply chain network, could make a huge difference to the profitability that the farmers were experiencing. So that was really, really important. And also bounds on labor because they didn't have enough workers. That was also very important. And productivity too. Okay. You needed to invest, for example, in the productivity of farm workers. And that we saw happening in our area. They were providing better shelters and so on. And I thought that was really good. There's a lot of positive change. Okay. So and give credit to the farmers, and they're struggling a tremendous amount now in the US too because of the tariffs. Okay, so and also this is very important, more direct sales, okay, could enhance their profits dramatically, and they were actually doing that and also improving the marketing. So that was really good to see. So then we started seeing, okay, what's happening in the real world? It wasn't just, like labor constraints on each link of the supply chain. There might be a labor constraint associated with a tier of supply chain networks. For example, freight service workers were like moving from one place to another. They were being challenged, okay, in different sectors in healthcare. There are immense challenges. We had nurses in the US traveling like across the country because there were such shortages of healthcare workers and so on. So developed a game theory paper, okay, which had, for example, 3 different types of constraints, okay? It would be constraints on labor associated with each separate link, okay? And this is like a competitive supply chain network economy. Then you could have a single amount of labor hours available across a tier, with different kinds of activities, production, transportation. Or what if you knew that you had a certain amount of labor hours and your employees could move? Okay, so they had different kinds of skill sets. And that I thought was really, really interesting because, for example, even in Scandinavia, SAS is an airline, right? Many of the airlines were disrupted in the pandemic. They weren't flying. There were hardly any passengers and so forth. So they decided, okay, our workers, our crew can be retrained as healthcare workers. That's totally, it's a completely different supply chain network. Okay, so we're wondering, what would happen in that kind of context. And we were doing a lot of work on migrant labor in the Northeast in the context of picking fresh produce such as blueberries. Because so many of the workers, they would start out in Florida, and then they would migrate up to New England, and many were getting sick and so on. So we found, impacts, even on a single link can be huge, okay? Addition of a competitor is also very, very challenging. But what became so clear is that investing in these workers is extremely important in terms of their productivity and also paying them fair wages. Okay, so because that affects the bottom line. You would think, oh, you pay higher wages and, your costs will go up and so forth, but that can actually have an improvement in terms of productivity, which we found. Okay, so that was very beneficial. So then we got contacted by a colleague, okay, Dr. Irma Goon, and said, let's start working on resilience of supply chain networks to labor disruptions. We think of labor disruptions, it doesn't have to be that labor is getting, the workers are getting sick or, sadly they're perishing. We could have a port strike and so forth, like we had for a few days back in October. Okay, so all these possibilities. So We've designed metrics on efficiency and resilience, okay, and also focusing on, having workers do different kinds of tasks, what would be the impact and so on. And also, what about e-commerce? What will that do in terms of enhanced resilience? So we found, okay, allowing workers to perform different tasks, enhances the resilience. It also enhances the efficiency, provided they have the right skills. And electric commerce can improve network efficiency, but not necessarily resilience, because you have other links that you have to deal with. So that was kind of interesting. But the movement of labor is like really, really important to enhance both efficiency and resilience. I thought that was good. So I actually ended up writing a book in the pandemic on that. And also, this is something, we have, high-end cybersecurity risks now and attacks. This is the book that got stolen. Okay, it was published by John Wiley and Sons, which is a top technology publisher. And we had emailed, okay, the book. They produced the cover, and then it got copied on multiple sites around the world. Okay, so my co-author is a fresh PhD. He was very, very upset. We wrote to the publisher, what can they do? They wrote cease and desist letters, but, no one's going to really listen. Okay, so that was really disappointing. So you can think of actually, cyber crime as being associated with, stealing credit cards and so forth. And that is actually a perishable product. So we did like a spatial price equilibrium model for cybercrime in financial services, where you can actually model the price over time of these stolen credit cards. And the price goes down because the probability of detection increases. Okay, so that was kind of cool. So what about international trade? Okay, international trade is now dominating the news. We know because of globalization. I think especially, those of us who live in, the northern part of the US and in Canada, we like our fresh produce in the wintertime, right? And a lot of the fresh produce, it comes from Mexico. We get the avocados, from South America, Central America. We get bananas and cherries in January, and blueberries from Peru. And that's very, very important. Okay. You look at the largest importers in the world, it's US, Canada. It's up there, not that high because of your population, but still it's there. Okay. And then largest exporters, right? And here we also have Canada. Okay, and China. And now with these, major trade wars, things change day to day, almost hour to hour. We're seeing the repercussions. Okay, so we still have 10% tariffs, okay, on all products coming into the US, and some are even higher. Okay, so I'll talk a little bit about tariffs. I think it's really important in policies. And we do a lot of work on spatial price network equilibrium modeling, okay, of trade. So there are unit tariffs, okay, there are ad valorem tariffs, which we're seeing now in practice. There are also quotas. And China is actually threatening with, zero exports to the US, which is, mind-blowing. So that would be a quota of zero, on all of these Chinese products that are going to the US. We also have something known as tariff rate quotas, and there are thousands of these that were imposed even in the pandemic, okay? Many of these are imposed on different kinds of agricultural products, and this is really interesting. If you have a quota, right? And if the imports are less than or equal to quota, you have a lower tariff or no tariff. But if your imports exceed that quota, you have a higher one. So it's kind of a two-tier tariff, and that's very challenging to model. And we had this happening in the first the Trump 1.0 administration, okay, and it's reaching the point, never seen before, the tarification, in 100 years. and with the stock market completely, on a roller coaster ride. So we see, hurting UK, what's going to happen to Canadian and Mexican imports, especially affecting the automobile industry and other products. And I was actually born in Windsor, Ontario, and we had lots of relatives in Detroit, and that bridge is extremely important when it comes to, automotive parts, going back and forth. Okay, so really believe in constructing computable operational mathematical models that enable decision makers, to figure out impacts of various policies. And it's very challenging research, but it's also really gratifying. So you see, so many products, so many agricultural products in particular have been subject to tariffs and tariff rate quotas. Okay. So these are some of the papers, that we published on tariffs. And this is kind of interesting. Some people in our community saying, oh, tariffs is such a new area. No, in 1996, we published a paper in the Annals of Operations Research. There was a group at Cornell University in Ithaca, New York. They have a department of like dairy sciences, and there were tariffs that were going to be imposed on Mexican dairy products coming to the U.S. And the outstanding agricultural economists, but they didn't have the methodological tools to do the modeling. We needed, because of asymmetries and so forth, you couldn't convert the equilibrium conditions into associated optimization problems. So we needed various inequalities. So they came up and we published several papers, and we continue to do work in this area. This is, a recent paper in JOGO, Journal of Global Optimization, mentioned, work published in EJOR and so on. Okay, so studying international trade of agricultural products is very important because, there's rising food insecurity around the world. Okay, it's terrible. And in Africa, in Asia, in the Middle East, even in the US, with a lot of food banks being challenged. So and on top of that, we're dealing with climate change. We're dealing with all sorts of disruptions to major transportation links, such as the Panama Canal and obviously the Suez Canal as well, because the attacks by the Houthis, okay, on the ships. So very, very challenging times now in terms of agricultural trade. So I'm very proud that UMass Amherst established a partnership with the Kiev School of Economics in Ukraine. And we're doing a lot of work with colleagues there, and also with one of my PhD students, Dana Hassani, and also another PhD, Ishmael. Okay, so these are some of our papers on agricultural trade, focusing on trade from Ukraine. Okay, and the most recent paper was actually published January, February issue of Transportation Science. And it has this kind of topology because there we care not only about the production and the demand, okay, but also the storage over time. Okay, because many of the silos in Ukraine have been attacked and the grain has been destroyed. Okay, and farmers are facing immense challenges because the mining of the land, the disruption to transportation routes and so forth. So the paper that I'd like to provide highlights for you today on is the following. It's called Quantification of International Trade Network Performance Under Disruptions to Supply, Transportation, and Demand Capacity, and also exchange rates in disasters. Okay, so this was published in an edited volume, which I also collaborated with several colleagues. It was based on a conference which we organized in Piraeus, Greece, on dynamics of disasters. So this is the kind of model. Let me give you the high level. We're going to have different supply markets, different demand markets, and we're interested in the production of different commodities, but focusing specifically on agricultural commodities. And we're Considering disasters, okay? So disruptions. Think of what the farmers have to deal with now in different parts of the world because of droughts, because of climate change, because of wars. For example, in Ukraine, they will have a fixed amount of capacity in terms of what they can plant, right? So we have upper bounds of different supply markets associated with how much they can plant, okay? And under different scenarios, kind of L, okay? So we kind of can reduce the upper bounds. And we also have upper bounds associated with trade, because that has been experienced, for example, on the Black Sea. The Black Sea, the grain initiative lasted for about a year, and then Russia pulled out, and there are all sorts of challenges, but Ukraine has gotten some assistance when it comes to protecting the maritime routes. Also, upper bounds on demand, because people can be leaving and so forth. There are disasters, they're migrating. Think of what happened to horrible Turkey, for example, the earthquakes a couple of years ago. And also exchange rates is something people aren't really studying. That's important. So interested in predicting the supplies, the production outputs of different commodities, the demands of different demand markets, and also the commodity shipments on different routes. It's important to have different routes. We have different underlying supply price, demand price, and transportation cost functions. And we state the equilibrium condition. Here we see, the Lagrange multipliers associated with the upper bounds are explicitly incorporated into our equilibrium conditions. So we say that you will have a positive volume of shipment of a commodity K from supply market I to demand market J on a route R if the supply market, okay, produce the supply price plus the unit transportation cost on the route multiplied by the relative exchange rate, plus the Lagrange multipliers associated with the upper bounds on the supply, right? The transportation routes and the demand is equal to the price the consumers are willing to pay. If all these different costs exceed the price the consumers are willing to pay, then you're not going to have trade between the supply and demand market pair. Okay, and also we have the Lagrange multipliers I mentioned associated with the various capacities. So we formulate, this problem as a single variational equality problem, which is really nice. Okay, we can have all sorts of qualitative results, and very important to have efficient algorithms. We have a very nice feasible set, which is just the non-negative ortho. So we get closed form expressions for the commodity shipments at each iteration, and also for the Lagrange multipliers. Okay, that's in the paper. And we have an international trade network performance indicator, for each of the disasters out. Okay, so what makes sense to us, and we build on work with Patrick Chang in the Fragile Networks book, we say the efficiency of a network, given the topology, supply price functions, the other functions, the upper bounds and exchange rates, is as following. Okay, on the average, okay, the efficiency is captured by the demand for a commodity, okay, at a demand market, divided by the price. Okay, so in other words, if the network can handle a higher demand, okay, relative to the price, we consider it as being performing better. Okay, which to us makes sense. And then you can have a unified one. We have probabilities associated with the different disaster scenarios, and we multiply, the efficiency for a particular scenario times the probability, and that becomes the efficiency overall. Okay, and also we have the initial efficiency when we don't have any kinds of disruption. So we can measure robustness then by, having everything working fine minus the efficiency under the different disaster scenarios. So the closer that measure is to zero, right, the better the network is performing in terms of robustness. So we also can do an importance indicator for, either a node or a combination of nodes and links, or a link, by measuring the efficiency drop. Okay, you have everything working fine. Okay, and then working without that particular network component and divide it over the original efficiency. Okay, so we've done a lot of work on data from Ukraine, okay, especially focusing on MENA countries, Middle Eastern, North African countries, because they've been challenged a lot. And they rely on exports such as wheat from Ukraine, okay, and a little bit less so in terms of corn. Okay, and they've been dealing with all sorts of crises, on top of, food challenges and obviously attacks and, currency issues and so on. So what our work consistently finds is that the maritime routes are extremely important. They have to be preserved as much as possible. Okay. And also, we found that subsidies, that's a type of policy, can assist farmers in wartime. And that's what the Ukrainian government is doing now. That's also extremely important. And they're challenged. They don't have enough liquidity. Their lands, about 30% of the land in Ukraine is mined. Can you imagine? You're going to harvest or you're going to plant, and you and your workers can just blow up. It's terrible. And also the transportation links, how should we be shipping on barges, on rail? And there are challenges there, but maritime shipping is extremely important. Okay, and in addition, we've integrated work on, the food quality deterioration in the context of bananas and the impacts of the Panama Canal. Okay, because now, because of the big drought and so forth, over the past couple of months, they haven't been able to transit as many ships as they have, previously. So what about making positive impact? Okay. We all believe in publishing or we will perish, journal articles, writing books became extremely important. Okay. I do a lot of writing for what is known as The Conversation. It's a copyright-free platform. And if you write an article there, it has to be on science. They like it when you base it on journal articles. Okay. It's not just opinion pieces and so on. And then it can get reproduced and republished by other major platforms. So usually when I have a couple of papers in an area, I will try and write an article, or sometimes they just approach me because you're known as an expert. And once you do that, you get contacted. I've been on Canadian radio, I've been on farm radio, BBC, sometimes late at night. Okay. And, it's sometimes challenging because you have to be ready. You have to know, your topic really well. And, but I very much enjoy working with the media and journalists because I learn a tremendous amount from them too. They will ask me sometimes a question, sometimes live on radio or TV, and like, I haven't thought about that and so forth, but it will enhance our research and so on. And in the pandemic, we were able to affect national policy in terms of healthcare in the US. We wrote an article a day after the declaration of the COVID pandemic by the World Health Organization on shortages in blood supply chains and what could be done. And then Informs also wanted an update for its analytics magazine, which I produced. Okay, and I'll tell you in a few minutes, how that influenced national policy. And I kept on writing, okay, because working on perishable product supply chains, I was very worried about, the vaccines against COVID. They required an ultra cold chain. Were the regions, the states, the countries getting ready for that? It was really, really important. So August 4, 2020, we didn't even have the vaccines, but I wanted to make sure, that this was emphasized. So I wrote an article on it and I continued to write. Okay. And one of the articles that I wrote, it's on the shipping container. It had to do, obviously, with logistics invented by Mr. McLean and how important it is. Okay. And obviously, there were shortages of shipping containers in the pandemic. They were in the wrong places and so on. And how do we do that? And we had Ever Given blocking also the Suez Canal. So that article has been used like multiple college courses around, I think, the world, not just the US. And in addition, it got like over about 350,000 reads very, very quickly. Okay. Unlike our papers, or maybe some of your papers, I don't know. So we continued to do a lot of writing on Ukraine and so forth, and writing letters to the editors, writing op-ed pieces and so on. And then journalists come to you because you're known as an expert in a certain area. and quite a few have become good friends of mine, even Wall Street Journal and New York Times and so on. And that's gratifying. Okay. And it's important to do. I think especially now it's extremely important given the new administration that we have in the US and so on. So going back to the blood supply chains, and this was Trump's first administration, okay? So I think, if you keep on writing and keep on speaking out, you might affect positive change, even though there are immense challenges, right? Immense challenges. So they wrote a memo saying, we need to do something about the blood supply chains. And my March 2020 article in the conversation, which was reprinted in Life Science, was the first reference on the first page. Okay. And Javier Becerra, he was the attorney general at that time. And our present governor, Maura Healey of Massachusetts, was one of the 21 attorney generals that signed the memo. And there is my article, okay, with the citation, okay. And he became actually the Secretary of Health and Human Services in the US under President Biden. No longer. Now we have Kennedy Jr., okay. But our Maura Healey, signed it, and she is now our governor, and she's also running for re-election. Okay, I wish her, well, because I think she's wonderful. So you see, you can make positive change, but I think you have to figure out the best way for you to communicate. Okay, also it's very important, I think, to work at the local kind of level with your legislators. Okay, sometimes you do it through social media, through direct messaging, through phone calls, through doing petitions and so on. But I think we shouldn't be quiet. And in the US, even some presidents of universities, they're essentially becoming quiet, and law firms and so on. And I don't think that's right. Okay. Okay, so I think our community is poised to continue to do great things. We're the ones that innovate. We're the ones that develop new methodologies when there are problems out there that require new methodologies. Okay, there's nothing out there to solve these problems. Like we've been working in game theory and problems. Okay, how do you solve this? We don't know. So you have to advance methodology. And I think that's what we're so good at doing. So I would like to thank you for listening. Thank you for the opportunity to speak to you today, and wish you and everyone at CORS all the very best.
Thank you very much, Professor Nagurney. What an interesting presentation. And you are just in time, so I will say not even, we have to alert you for early finishing or something like that. So thanks once again, and now the floor is open for questions. If the audience has any question for Professor Nagurney, we can put them now. Yes, Dr. Prashant has a question.
Is it in the chat?
Oh no, I was just applauding. Sorry.
Okay, all right. Okay, so
that's sweet of you. Thank you.
So are there any questions from the audience?
I can ask one. Thank you,
Yeah, sure.
Anna, for a great talk. It's really nice to listen to you. I saw in the title of the book where you drilled a bit deeper into the work on the disruption. You had in the title demand capacity, and I tried to figure out what you mean with demand capacity. Would you care to explain?
You're talking about the capacities that we have?
No, I'm talking about, so you had a book title, right, on the disruption management, and there is like it's a relatively long title, and it's like disruption, and then there is like demand capacity as a term. If I saw it correctly, I was just curious. It piqued my curiosity of the terminology about demand capacity.
Okay, I think I'm missing some of that. Okay, so some of my books have long titles with subtitles, or not coming?
No. Okay, so maybe I don't recall the number of the slide, but it was okay. So forget about the question if you don't see the link. It was it was on one of the book
audio
titles.
isn't
It's
coming
okay.
in really well.
Okay, sorry about the weird question. Thank you.
Feel free to write in the chat. Maybe that would be easier.
Okay. So if there are no other questions, then I will maybe ask a question so that others can make use of this great opportunity to talk with Professor Nagurney. So Professor Nagurney, you have talked about different types of uncertainty, including demand uncertainty, supply uncertainty, which we see commonly addressed in literature. There is less reference to transportation uncertainty and exchange rate uncertainty that you talked about. So is there some ranking or some relative importance of these uncertainties, or it just does not matter? Why some are more prominent in literature and some are less referred to?
Okay, see, this is a general framework, but then we applied it to exports from Ukraine to MENA countries and so forth. So there, obviously, I would say the supply, the production, the planting is extremely important, and the transportation, the demand is not so much. Okay, and I think in different contexts around the world, I think the production capacities also will be extremely important because of challenges associated with climate change that we're seeing in South America, that we're seeing in Africa too, and uncertainties associated with transportation in terms of the major links, the canals. I think that's also very big. Demand uncertainty, I would say that's less important, but it kind of made sense to include it because I was thinking, of disasters and then people, for example, move and so forth. You might not know where they move to. So like, where are the markets and things like that. And we've been also thinking with the upheaval in tariffs, it would make sense to also add, tariffs, and uncertainty associated with tariffs. Okay. And maybe something very dynamic, but a lot of work still needs to be done on parameterizing and so forth, and maybe making correlated uncertainties and things like that. Okay, so I think this is and we're doing a lot of work also on risk management now and insurance, which I think is huge, even war risk insurance with Ishmael, he's here. Okay, cargo, okay. Crop and cargo insurance, because there you have so many disruptions. How do you plant? What do you plant and so forth? What about cargo insurance when you're being attacked on the Black Sea, when you're being attacked in the Suez Canal and the Red Sea? And that's something we found that, the government is going to have to subsidize, and that's what they're doing in Ukraine because the cost of insurance is so high. Okay, in wartime, and there aren't many insurance companies that are funding war risk insurance, but we find that pretty relevant and interesting.
And my second and last question is about the super networks. So you have chosen the name super networks over mega networks or very large networks. So could you elaborate on this? What is key to super networks?
Sure. Super networks are networks of networks. So we think of like how the internet interacts with financial networks, transportation networks, how social networks interact with maybe financial networks and so on, and also supply chains. And Canada in 2008, 2009, when we had the huge financial collapse in the US and Lehman Brothers collapse, Canada had really good relationships with the bankers, okay, and their customers and clients, and you didn't suffer as much. So, we model like social networks, the costs go down and so forth if you have a higher relationship, better relationship levels and so on. And also we were one of 5 teams in the US that got big grants from the National Science Foundation to re-envision the internet, have a better internet. And that was very cool because you have operations research working with the electrical and computer engineers and computer science and, trying to educate kind of, different behaviors. And they love the supply chain concept and so on. So that was interesting. That was a great deal of fun. But now things are not fun in the US in terms of funding from the federal government. and stamps. I'm very worried about, I think Canada will benefit. I think I have a couple of friends already. I have moved from Yale to University of Toronto that fast. Timothy Snyder, his wife Marcy Shore, and Jason Stanley left Yale to go to University of Toronto, like that, and more will be leaving and going to Europe. So I think Canada will benefit. I think also maybe many medical professionals. So I'm happy for you, and I want to get my citizenship like back soon. So keeping my fingers crossed. I think this is a good omen, though. Okay, maybe.
Thanks.
You know.
Thanks so much, Professor Nagurney.
You're
Too
welcome.
much
Thank you
energy
very much
around.
for organizing.
We-
Thank you, everyone. I will stop sharing.
Okay. All right. So now it's time to move to our second speaker, Professor Emma Freijinger, who is with us right now. So I will request her to share the screen. And in the meantime, I will present a brief bio of Professor Freijinger. Emma Freijinger is a professor in the Department of Computer Science and Operations Research at Université de Montreal, where she holds a Canada Research Chair and an Industrial Chair funded by the Canadian National Railway Company. Her research is application-driven and focuses on innovative combination of methodologies from machine learning and operations research to solve large-scale decision-making problems. She has extensive experience working with industry and has led collaborative research projects. She also works as a scientific advisor for Ivardo Labs, developing AI solutions for supply chain industry. Prior to University of Montreal, Emma was a faculty member at KTH Royal Institute of Technology in Sweden. She holds a PhD in mathematics from EPFL, Switzerland. So without taking any time, I will pass it on to Professor Emma Freijinger for her talk.
Thank you very much for the invitation and thank you for the introduction. Can you hear me clearly?
Yes, we can hear you very well.
Okay, and you see my screen too?
Yes, we can see.
Okay, awesome. I don't think I see, so we'll see if I see the chat. Otherwise, just please interrupt me with questions if you have any while I'm presenting. So I chose to present a particular paper in this talk. I'll provide some background, but it's really going to be focused on the paper that you see. The full reference below. It is it was work led by Robin Legault when he was a student under my supervision, and he is currently at MIT. We're going to shift a bit focus compared to the previous talk in the sense that I'm going to take a particular organization perspective, so optimization for a particular company or a particular organization. So it's a bit of a switch of focus. And I'll start off with like sort of three maybe key points that I want to make in this talk. And so if you want to, rest afterwards, or try to pick up those, feel free. I think one important aspect is in this angle, demand uncertainty. So when we take a particular company's perspective, oftentimes we're interested in demand uncertainty. And demand uncertainty many times is decision dependent, so it's endogenous. And this makes the decision-making problems hard to solve. And it also makes the learning problem very hard and trying to characterize such distributions. So that's one takeaway, sort of like these problems. I think that we need more research on this type of problems. And this is one angle on such problems. So optimizing subject to decision-dependent demand uncertainty. The second point is that we're sort of taking one problem and we're making the formulation much larger by working on a sample average approximation. But switching to a sample average approximation means that we can leverage a different kind of formulation, in our case, a maximum covering formulation. And we use that to devise an efficient algorithm. So we're going for a larger formulation, which would usually be doomed, but then in terms of algorithms, we can really use the characteristics of that formulation. And that's what I'm going to try to convey in this presentation. And the third point that I want to make in this presentation is that the entropy of the uncertainty matters. So we are providing an information theoretic analysis of the demand uncertainty associated with our problem. And that actually has important implications because we can compute the entropy before solving an instance. And actually, the entropy is explaining why one algorithm would perform better than the other. And it also allows us to, in that sense, choose algorithms. So these are sort of the three key points that I want to make. Okay, let me see. Now I need to actually switch slides. Okay, so I hope now I switch slides. This is just a view to narrow down on the scope that I'm going to talk about. I anchor this on the decision pipeline, like again, from a particular organization point of view that probably many of you are very familiar with. This is nothing new, but usually in a data-driven pipeline, we have some access to some data, and this data we can use for learning. And oftentimes we have some, contextual information about our problem. So the features, and we also have information about whatever is uncertain in our decision-making problem. So that gives me to the blue box, which is the optimization. I hope you can see my mouse when I'm pointing, where the optimization problem can be contextual in the sense that it depends on those features. So we want to make use of recent information. And it can be subject to uncertainty. So we need learning to characterize that uncertainty or quantify the uncertainty or train some model that estimates distributions or make point predictions, right? And we use mathematical programming to formalize this optimization problem. And in our case, we're focusing then on this endogenous uncertainty that I was alluding to earlier. Oftentimes we have a human in the loop. I will not focus too much about that. We implement the solutions, which generates new data. And if we're in the setting where our demand uncertainty, has this decision dependence, it also means that our data may be censored or constrained when we're generating the data generating process is constrained. So a typical example is transportation services. If I don't have any transportation service in a particular area, I will not see any demand. If I have a transportation service that is saturated at capacity, I may not observe what is the actual demand for that service. I'm only observing what we have a capacity for, right? So this is why it's a bit tricky when using this data for learning demand distributions. And what I'm going to focus on today is really single or two-stage optimization problems. Here it's going to be single state. And I'm going to assume that we have already trained model, and it's a stochastic formulation in the sense that we have distributional information about the demand model. And I'm going to focus on a competitive facility location problem, and I'll describe to you what I mean there. And the main goal of this was to say, how can we solve efficiently that problem without making strong assumptions about the demand distribution? Okay. We wrote recently a survey. So this is by Utsav Sadana and co-authors. I'm one of them, and we're a number. I think there are 5 or 7, 6, 7 authors of this survey that we wrote on contextual optimization. So if you're interested in how to integrate learning and optimization to solve contextual optimization problems, I encourage you to check out the survey. It's published in eJournal. Okay. I'll not dwell too much into the importance of the demand uncertainty. In this case, it can be important for various reasons. Some of the problem I'm going to talk to you about today is a strategic or tactical planning problem. So usually with the time horizon, uncertainty becomes more important. When it comes to demand, why we care about demand uncertainty, there may be different reasons. It could be that, the population has very heterogeneous preferences and constraints, so we have imperfect knowledge about what that demand would be, especially if we're interested in demand at the very granular level. If we're interested in demand at a very high level, there may be a lot less uncertainty, but if we want it granular, the uncertainty can be higher. We also know that there can be important volatility in consumption patterns, impacts by social media. It can be impacted by different types of events and so forth. So here I'm thinking, for instance, about transportation and supply chains that can have volatility in demand when we're looking from a particular company's perspective. And as Anna was referring to, there can be also a lot of other issues and other sources of uncertainty and impacts like the geopolitical situation. Okay. Now, as I mentioned before, modeling demand can be very challenging, especially when we have this decision dependence and we have the supply that is constrained. So we have constraining on the data. And something that I think people may not think too much about sometimes is that if we're in a highly dynamic environment, oftentimes we need to live with very small data, even if we have a very long history of data, simply because the long history of data is no longer relevant. So for those of you who are working on the learning problems, there are a lot of things to be said about challenges related to data in dynamic environments and how to learn from relatively small amounts of data, but that's a topic for another talk. Okay, so the objective here, coming back to, so I hope now you see the scope. We're going to focus only on the optimization side. So the blue box that I showed you before, I'm going to assume that I have some model that has been trained, but I do not want to make strong assumptions about what is exactly that type of model, right? Because I know depending on the data that maybe I need different kinds of models. So I want to have a solution method that does not make strong assumptions about this predictive model. And what I'm going to use as an example for this is what we call choice-based competitive facility location problem. It has characteristics which makes it really challenging. It has this endogenous uncertainty. We have binary decisions, so facility location decisions. And so it's challenging from many points of view, which makes it a very nice class of problems to work on. And the outline of the presentation is that first I'll describe what is this problem. I'll then go into show you the methodology that we're proposing. And then we have quite an extensive numerical study. And I hope I will have time to at least showcase some of those results, but I will make sure at least to give you the key takeaways. Okay, I saw that there was something in the chat. I'm not sure. I'm going to pause just for 30 seconds or so. Do you have any questions on the scope of the presentation? Contextual optimization, what it means. Okay, sure. Contextual optimization focuses on using the most recent information or takes into account the fact that I'm solving an optimization problem, but it is subject to some context that I'm given in. So this could be features. Let's say that you have some explanatory features. Some of the examples that are used in the literature oftentimes is like a shortest path problem. It's very simple to think about. You want to solve the shortest path, but depending on, let's say, the time of the day or the weather or whatever contextual features, this may impact what are going to be the travel times that I'm going to use to solve my problem. So on the one hand, it's uncertain. And this uncertainty, depends on these contextual features. So now when I'm solving my optimization problem, I'm solving, let's say I have a stochastic formulation, some distributional assumption. This distributional assumption is going to be contextual on those features. So it's conditional on those features. And now I'm optimizing conditional on that. And I want to find a good policy that over time will perform well as these contextual features are changing. Does this answer the question? I see you nodding. Okay, awesome. Any other questions before I move on? Okay. Otherwise, feel free. I'll try to see if there's something coming up, but just, yes, another?
So, do you mean that the contextual optimization problems, are they separable with respect to the context, or is there an overarching interlink between all the contextual problems? So if I understand you correctly, what you said is the context is different in the morning, it's different in the afternoon, and different in the evening. So is it okay that I split the problem into like all the morning problems together, all the afternoon, or is it separable that way, or is there an interlink between them?
So the idea is not necessarily to separate them. It's to have one formulation of this optimization problem, but I'm going to have these distributions that characterize the uncertainty that are conditional on the context. And we want those distributions to generalize well over all contexts, right? So we're not like separating them, like which would be like saying I'm categorizing and having a different sort of formulation for each. We want generalization across these distributions. Okay. So this is the overall like setup. Now I'm going to set a bit, there is a contextual link to this work where in our distribution we have such contexts, but the understanding of contextual optimization is not necessarily, it's not necessary to get this, the specifics of the problem I'm going to move to next. All right. Okay, so what is this choice-based competitive facility location problem? And here I'm going to use the illustration, which is in a grayscale, but I'm going to explain to you what it means so that you're familiar with the problem. The objective is to maximize expected market share of a new firm that enters an existing market. And so what we mean here with maximize expected market share is that we want to capture demand by introducing new facilities. So let's look at this figure that you have. You're seeing triangles. Triangles are any potential locations of me that I can choose to open or to keep closed. Here in this particular snapshot, any triangle that is white is open and any triangle that is gray is closed, okay? You also see some black diamonds. I hope that you can see those black diamonds. These are locations of the competition. They're already there. So in this image, there are 10 competition locations and there are 50 possible facilities that I can choose from, but I have a budget of only 15. So I need to select where to open facilities such that I'm capturing as much demand as possible. So what is demand here? Each potential customer is illustrated with a circle. And these circles have different colors. And that depends on the likelihood that I'm going to capture this customer, so the probability of capture. If you see a white, it means that the probability of capture is very high. If it's very dark, it means the probability of capture is very low. So you can see around competitor locations, these circles are dark, right? So the probability of capture is very low because they are close to this competitor. So here we're assuming that the probability depends mainly on the distance. So probability decreases with the distance from the facility. Then you can see if I have an open facility here and there are almost no competitors around, there's going to be a ton of white and I'm going to capture a lot. Okay. Now, this is decision-dependent uncertainty because these distributions they will depend on how I'm locating, right? Because I can impact this distance that matter to the customers by changing where, like, my decisions change where I'm located. It will change the distances for these people and hence their distributions and which facilities that they are that will attract them. Okay. What the examples on the contextual features here would be if there are features of these locations that potentially I can also decide, or that I'm not deciding, that are completely exogenous to my problem. Any questions on the problem setup? Because this is important for what comes next.
Yeah, I have a question.
Yeah.
So if I understand correctly, those colors to those customers are put something like a choice model. That's what you have mentioned.
Yes.
Maybe like a logit or something. And then, so is the choice model run after opening the white diamonds or before opening the white diamonds? Or white
Excellent.
triangles?
Yeah, excellent question. So the probabilities will not be pre-computed. The probabilities and the distributions will change as I'm searching over the solution space. And so that's why we really need to take into account this decision dependence. And I'll drill down to the details here, but you're absolutely right. These are choice models. And that's why we call it like the choice-based competitive facility location problem.
Right. So yeah, so the color topography, whatever you have now, that will change if you change the position of the white triangles.
Exactly.
Okay. Yeah. Thank you.
You're welcome. So what is the general formulation then? We want to maximize the captured market shares. We have market share of open facilities. So you see the set DX is the set of locations that we have chosen. This set depends on X. That's why it's indexed by X. X are our binary decision variables. And we want to maximize the market share. What is the market share? Well, it depends on the customers that we can attract. Here, we're assuming a choice model, which is a utility maximization model. So we're assuming that customers will maximize their utility. And this utility, I'll drill down more into details afterwards, but let's just say that each customer associated utility with each facility, not only the ones that we're offering, but any of them, because they can also choose to go to the competition, right? So what matters to us is the amount of demand that we capture. So whether we are offering facilities which have higher utility compared to the competition, but the customers can choose anyone, which is the set CX, which is the union of what the competition is offering and what we are offering. And this is going to change depending on our decisions. And the utilities, they depend on who is the customer, so where is their location, whether, you know, all kinds of characteristics we may know of them. We also have characteristics of, you know, the locations themselves, coefficients that would capture, and this would be then trained, right? So this is not something I'm focusing on here, but we assume that we have some model that has been trained on data that characterizes this. Okay, so for those of you who may not be familiar with discrete choice models or random utility maximization models, I just want to put one slide here that shows that this utility function is just, you know, some function of features, and it has parameters. And it's random to us as modelers because we're not observing perfectly everything. So we have these random terms that are called epsilon. What is important here is not necessarily which, you know, how this looks like here, but we can see that if this function, which I call h here, is linear in our decision variables, then you know, the whole utility is going to be linear in decision variables. Usually we're not looking at these in terms of utilities, we're looking at the probabilities, and that's what I was showing earlier, right? In the figure, I was showing this color depending on the probability. Now, the probability expression really depends on the assumptions that we have about these random terms. And Prashant, as you were mentioning earlier, like, oh, maybe this is a logit, right? So if I assume that these epsilons are IID extreme value distributed or Gumbel distributed, this random utility maximization will give me the logit model, or what we could call also like the softmax or that we're very familiar working with. Now, what is important here is even for this most simple model, it becomes nonlinear in X clearly, right? So when we're looking at this literature on choice-based optimization in general, or choice-based competitive facility location problems, usually, or some of that work really focuses on the exact expressions of these models. So let's say the loaded model, how can we work with this in a mathematical programming formulation? How can we, come up with some ideally linear formulation for our problem that we can solve efficiently? That's when working in probability space. More recently, there are work going, or relatively recently, saying like, okay, let's set the probabilities aside because we know they're causing us issues, they are nonlinear. So let's sample instead from these utilities. And then we can create a sample average approximation of these probabilities. And what is nice is that then we have something that is linear in our decision variables as long as these utilities are linear. Okay. So this is the idea. And drilling even further into the literature, what we distinguish is a generative perspective and a conditional perspective. And the work up to date, from best of my knowledge, has been conditional, and we're introducing this generative perspective. So what is conditional perspective here? It means that we assume that we have some sample from the population, and here a set of customers, and we're representing how important that sort of customer profile is by having some weight associated with that individual to get it to like a population-based model. But we have like conditional on this population perspective. We associate a weight with individuals, and then we have our choice models, and this is how we get like from this individual choice model to market shares. This is in contrast to a generative perspective, where we may just view these customers, alternatives, and so forth as we represent them by random variables. And now we're maximizing the market share with respect to this joint distribution of these random variables, right? And here, if you're familiar with choice models, I put the expressions. If you're not familiar with choice models, you can completely ignore it. But I'm going to distinguish here this very simple setting of the multinomial logit model. And here MMNL means a mixture, so a logit mixture, which is known to be a very general model, but it does not have this analytical expression as we know for the logit model. Okay, so now if we have a look at what we're going to compare to approaches in the literature, is that on one hand we have exact methods. The best performing one, at least when we wrote this work, was the multi-count outer approximation algorithm by Mayan Lodi. More recently, there is also a heuristic method. It's a sort of three-phase algorithm. It's an approximation algorithm, and it combines like a greedy heuristic with a local search. And then we have the sample average approximation view that I told you earlier, but from a conditional perspective, right? So it would be that you have this population of individuals that you have observed, and now you sample scenarios for each of those individuals such that you can create a sample average approximation of your model. And you can see it here that we still have these weights that I introduced earlier. But I have now introduced this capital S here, which is the scenarios. And we're going to compare to these methods. And looking more at, so there is quite a number of works on this particular problem, and there are even more works if we look at choice-based optimization. And really what they are distinguishing themselves is either they are really specialized to deal with a particular type of model, or they're sort of based on simulation, in which case they can deal with any model. So this is what you're seeing in the first one, and then our papers, and then the other one. And then, of course, the method can be it's heuristic or exact, given like a very large number of scenarios. I do want to draw your attention a bit to a very recent paper, February in iJoc, that is generalizing the modeling view of our paper to move beyond even random utility maximization models. Our contribution here is about proposing an efficient algorithm. But we do assume that we have random utility maximization models. So they are not leveraging the same algorithmic tricks as we are, but they're dealing with more types of problems, assortment optimization, and so forth. So this is quite a nice paper. I saw maybe there is, okay. So this is about the literature. Any questions so far about what exists before I move into what we are proposing? Okay. So we're going to take this generative perspective, and what I'm going to get to is a partial Bender's decomposition method. So what we're going to show is that we're going to generalize the sample average approximation, and we're going to devise an algorithm, which is this partial Bender's decomposition, and we're going to reduce the size of a problem, and we're going to do that without introducing any hyperparameters or user-defined parameters to reduce the size of the problem. And that's the key trick here. So we start off now, the top box here, you should be familiar with now. It's exactly the same that I was showing you earlier, right? So we have our problem, but we're having this generative perspective where we're viewing that we need to maximize captured market shares by considering the joint distribution of the random variables that characterize our demand. What we're going to do now is something that might seem completely stupid, which is to go from this generative perspective to a deterministic equivalent, but that is huge. Okay, so our deterministic equivalent of our original problem is a maximum covering problem. But how we transform it into a maximum covering problem is that we're going to consider preference profiles. So we will consider any kind of preference profile that these customers can have, and then we're going to associate a weight with those profiles that corresponds to the probability that any randomly selected customer would exhibit that profile. These are these weights. Now, what you may notice here is that here we have binary decision variables X. Now we still have them, but we have added these binary decision variables Y, which will decide whether would be in the set of these preference profiles, and we will actually see that there is an exponential number of profiles, right? So this is like unmanageable to do, but it's a deterministic equivalent. And what we're going to actually consider when we're solving is a sample average approximation of that deterministic equivalent. So when you see a hat, it's a sample average approximation. So essentially, we're sampling these profiles, and now we're considering only the set of sampled or observed profiles. Okay. Now, obviously, this one may be a subset of the full set of profiles, but it may still be very large. And so this is where this partial Bender's decomposition come into play. But this is sort of the overview of what I'm going to tell you next, a little bit more into detail. But this, which looks like an unmanageable problem formulation to solve, it actually turns out that we can solve this very, very efficiently with a few tricks. Okay. So I will not go too much into the details, but I want to give you sort of the intuition around what is going on here. So a preference profile is simply the subset. Each profile corresponds to a subset of locations that we are offering that are preferred by the customer compared to the competition. Okay, so we're just enumerating whatever can be preferred compared to the competition. And this is captured by these vectors A. So you can see when I'm looking at these vectors here, I can have any combination of these subsets of our locations that may be preferred to the competition. And there is obviously an exponential number of such profiles. Yes.
Can you please explain one vector A? What does that mean? What are the zeros and what are the ones?
Yeah, so here you would have a vector which is of the size of the set D, which are all of the possible locations that we could offer. And if each element in that vector decides whether that location is preferred by the customer over any of the competitor locations or not, right? So this customer, let's say, if a customer has this profile, there is only one location that it prefers over any of the competitor locations. It's the last one, okay? But you can have any of the combinations of our locations that could be, any subsets of our
I'm
locations that
extremely
could
sorry.
be.
I think I'm losing you. I'm sorry if it is a problem on my side. Could you repeat?
Yeah, so can other people hear me, or are you losing me, all of you? That would be good if anyone could just write in the chat if you hear me. Okay, so the idea here is that a 1 in this vector means that any customer having that profile will prefer that location over any of the competitor locations. Okay, but now what I need is to have a vector A that represents any possible preference. You're still not hearing me?
Yeah, I mean, kind of. That's okay. Yeah, maybe I'll catch up later. That's fine.
Okay. It would be good if somebody else could just say whether they're having similar
So,
issues, in
but the
which
thing
case.
is, the way that this preference vector gets manifested or gets realized is it depends on some underlying probability distribution, which ultimately ties to your logic model or choice model, right?
Exactly, right? So now what I'm doing is that I'm just enumerating any kind of profile, but where the choice model comes into play is in these weights here, right? Because I want to max your market share. So now I want to know what is the probability that any randomly selected customer will have a particular profile. And this is really where the choice model comes into play. So this would be this expression here, right? My weight. So now I have any kind of profile, and now I have these weights, okay? But I cannot compute this, right? I don't know how to compute this. So this is where we're going to do the sample average approximation. But this is the deterministic equivalent reformulation from what we saw from before. So if I now move into how we're actually computing it, we need to do the sample average approximation. So now you can see that I've introduced hats in a number of places. So here you can see the W is a hat. So simply what I'm doing is that I'm going to compute these weights based on whatever I have observed or sampled. And also I will have these preference profiles, which will be the capital P hat here, which now has all of the profiles which has occurred somehow in my sample, right? So this is why this might already be a smaller formulation. Still, the issue is that as I would increase my scenario generation for the sample average approximation, this is likely still going to be of unmanageable size. But the idea is that now I'm having these preference profiles along with the weights that are going to characterize fully my distribution. And what is important is that these ones, my UDs here, I'm still in utility space in everything that I'm doing here. Okay, so I hope that it's clear now that we're having this sample average approximation. There are a few tricks, but this is just a different view on the same problem. So this is an equivalent reformulation, but still we don't expect that we would be able to solve this, right? Because of the exponential size of this set p hat. So now we're getting into, let's look at what are the characteristics of this formulation and what are sort of characteristics of random utility maximization models. And one very nice feature here is that the objective function of our model is submodular under any random utility maximization model. So what does this mean? It means that we have diminishing returns. And if we take the example that we had from before, so the triangles are still our locations. You can see that here in the top left, I'm having one location open, and you see that I have a few ones in gray that I could choose to open, but one is open here, and I have my competitor locations. Now, let's say I assume to open this red one down on it's the figure on the left-hand side down corner. It will increase my market share by 7.43%. If I now move to the column on the right, and let's say that I have 2 open locations to start with, but I add the same location after that, because of this diminishing return, the market share that I'm going to capture is less than the one when I went from 1 open location to opening this than when I already had 2 and I'm opening my other one. Okay, so this is what it means. And we can show that this is submodular for any random utility maximization model. So this means that what we could leverage is that we're only going to explicitly represent a subset of these preference profiles that I was referring to before in our formulation. Okay, so we explicitly choose a subset, and then the remaining ones, we're just going to model that captured market share with an auxiliary variable that we bound by submodular costs. So now, obviously, the next question then becomes, yeah, sure, but how are you selecting this subset of preference profiles that you want to include? Okay, so this is just in math what I was explaining to you earlier. So now you can see that we've gone from our deterministic equivalent with the sample average approximation, which has this hat, to the one now that we're explicitly saying that we're considering p hat 1. P hat 1 is the subset that we have chosen to include explicitly in our formulation. You can see that we have p hat 1 here now. And then we have new here, this auxiliary variable that is captured the market share of all of the remaining profiles, which could be called p hat 2. And these ones we are bounding with our submodular cuts. I don't need to go more into details, but there's some theoretical justification for doing this. Okay, so how do we choose this partition? Any questions so far? Is it clear what I'm trying to do? So we're going from this, formulation to introducing this preference profiles. It becomes a huge formulation that is unmanageable. And now I'm trying to reduce the size of the preference profiles in a way such that, my method is still exact if we have a large number of scenarios. Okay. So now I don't want the user to define this, right? Just saying like, oh, this is going to be my P1. Ideally, I want an algorithm to tell me like, this is the best P1. This is the best subset for your problem. And I want to do so by using my choice model. My choice model should tell me like, this is what you should use. We know that we have these diminishing returns, right? So now we're going to use this submodularity of our objective function when we're devising this algorithm. So what we're doing is that we're just going to order our preference profiles according to their weights. Okay, so you can see that I have indices here that I've introduced where I'm just saying like, index number 1 is going to be the profile which has the highest weights according to my choice model. Then I'm taking the second highest weights and so forth. So I have this ordering of the profiles. And now this becomes a very classical clustering task, right? The name of the game is that I want to identify the index of the profile where I having like this cutoff in my function, and this function is increasing if I'm looking at the the market share, like I'm representing, or the weights that I'm representing of the demand, it is an increasing function, but it has diminishing returns because I have ordered everything according to the weights. I'm going to show you an illustrative example soon. So I just want to identify like the maximum curvature place of this curve, and this will give me like my knee in my clustering algorithm. And so this is all known like in machine learning to do this kind of clustering tasks. So we're using known methods to deal with discrete data, and we can characterize what is the optimal value for this problem. And we don't have any user-defined parameters. So what does this look like? It looks like this, right? So on the x-axis here, you see the ratio of the profiles I have included in P1 compared to all of the profiles that I have sampled. Okay, so it goes from 0 to 1, including all of them or including none. And then on the y-axis, what you're seeing is the sum of these weights. Okay, so the sum of the weights of the demand that these profiles represent divided by the total amount of demand. Okay, so here you see the point of maximum curvature that occurs here. This is our knee. And what this means is that here I have 0.1. So it means 10% of the observed profiles account for, if I go up to here, 54% of the demand, right? And now you really see this increasing curve with, but with decreasing marginals here. So here is my best according to the clustering. I'm going to call this the delta star. And you can clearly see that if I include these 10% of the observed profiles in my P1 that I represent explicitly, I'm just using 10%, but I will represent more than the half of the demand, right? 54% of the demand. So this is the power of this. If I have a strong curvature of this curve, I can gain a lot by using this kind of, simplification where I'm just using a subset of the profiles. Questions? I will need to move on fast because I see time flies. So this turns out to work really well. So I will just give you the intuition here, because I think this shows really what we're going to see in the numerical results, but I will probably not have time to go through all of them. But we see here, I just show the illustrative example from the New York data set that we use in the numerical examples, but it's exactly the same sort of conclusion for all of the results. And now what was on the y-axis from before is now the x-axis. So this is the share of the demand that are accounted for by the profiles in P1. Okay, the knee here was 54%. So the knee corresponds to here. Now you have two y-axes. Be careful. So on the right-hand side here, you have the average number of cuts that we need to introduce, right, for our auxiliary variables. At the 0, 1, it would be like a pure bender. So we don't have any of these separations. We don't have any of the demand in our P1. And we can see that these average number of submodular cuts are decreasing here. Okay, and it goes down. But there is a trade-off if we're looking at the average cardinality of our P1, which, the larger the P1, the harder the problem to solve, the larger the formulation. We can see that in the beginning, it is small, but as we're moving up to the right here, we're including more and more and more in P1, the formulation is going to become very large, right? And what we highlighted in dark here, black, is the knee that we identified, okay? And this is something that we see in the instances that it achieves this right trade-off. If we look here at average computing time for the same data set, it's an average over 100 instances. On the y-axis here, you have computing time. And here you see the compute time for this black bar, which is dot. And at the knee, you can see that we have found a point where the compute time is also low because of this trade-off that I was showing earlier. Okay. So I hope that I have now conveyed the intuition that these profiles, okay, their weight is determined by the choice model. If I have a high concentration of profiles, it will lead to a large reduction in my problem size, right? But now, how can we characterize this level of concentration across the different profiles? Because we see now that if I have a problem where almost all of the individual have the same profile, I will keep generate the same profile in my sampling, and this would lead then to high benefit of this maximum covering formulation that we're proposing. But if I have a totally uniform distribution, there is not a high concentration, and likely this will work less well. And this is exactly what we can show with an information theoretic analysis. So we're introducing an entropy measure of this preference profiles in the population. So you can view this that we have our true random variable with the distribution with whose support is any of the profiles, and the probability is these weights that we saw earlier, right? So now we can write we can compute the entropy of our empirical distribution that we have drawn from this. And what we're seeing is that the distance between the true and the observed weight distribution is maximized by the maximum entropy distribution. So this means that if we have a completely uniform, which would be useless demand model, but anyways, if the theory is the worst case, it's also going to be the worst case for our solution quality. And we can also link these entropy measures to the performance of our clustering approach, where our delta star, which was our clustering solution, is the total variation distance between the empirical and the uniform distribution. So this tells us the key takeaway is that the computational advantage of our approach is less likely to be there. So we have less computational advantage if the entropy is close to its upper bound, which would be a uniform distribution. Okay, so now again, let's look at the example, and I see I'm almost running out of time. Is now on the x-axis here, you see our entropy measure, right? So it's just a simple entropy measure of our empirical distribution. Here we have relatively low uncertainty and a high concentration of profiles. And here we have a relatively high uncertainty and a low concentration of profiles. So here you can see the cardinality of our sets. And now we're looking at comparing 3 different methods. So our sample average approximation, which is an aggregation compared to original one, because we're aggregating across profiles. We have a pure Benders decomposition, and then we have our partial Benders decomposition that we are proposing. And you can see that it has an edge over the other two, all the way up to the point where the entropy is very large. If the entropy is very large, it does not pay off to use our method, but only in that case. Otherwise, we have an edge. And when we're looking, this New York City data set is actually quite easy problems to solve. And when we're looking at problems, instances that are harder to solve, we can have a huge gain in terms of speed and also reduction of formulation size. For any of the instances where entropy is relatively low. So I see that I'm almost running out of time. So if I can have a minute to wrap up.
Sure, you have 5 minutes, 5 more minutes.
Okay, good. So obviously in 5 minutes, I'm not going to have a time to go through all of the results. I will refer to the paper, which is published in iJOC, as I mentioned earlier. What we do is that we test our algorithm on 2 types of benchmarks. One is this conditional view, so that we can compare to existing best performing, like the state-of-the-art algorithms. And then we're introducing a new set of benchmark instances that we are sharing on the iDoc website, which are generative mixed logit instances that are more challenging to solve. And I'm just going to do the key takeaways, which is that in comparison to these model-specific algorithms that really leverages, like if we have a logit model, they are really tailored to perform the best possibly for the logit model. Our general model still outperforms the benchmarks by a margin, or sometimes with less of a margin, as long as the entropy is not extremely high, right? And as I was mentioning earlier, if the entropy is really, really high, it means that our predictive model is essentially useless. So it's interesting from an academic point of view. I don't think that it's the most interesting setting from a practical point of view, where we hope that our models are useful. We can see that when the entropy is low or medium size, we see a drastic reduction in model size, and that's sort of where the speed up comes from. And we also see that solution quality really improves with increasing number of scenarios. And because of our clustering method, we can deal with a huge number of scenarios, which means that we're also achieving higher quality solutions when we're doing like a quality assessment on a very, very large number of scenarios. So in the results we're presenting, we're assessing on like 1 million of scenarios or something like this, and we're comparing how good quality the algorithms are. So there we see that we get an edge also in terms of solution quality. We also see that in terms of entropy, actually one of the existing methods perform well on the high entropy. And I think this is particularly interesting because it means that we can compute the entropy before solving the instance and make an algorithmic choice. Like if you have a problem is going to be very high entropy compared to like the maximum entropy, which is the uniform distribution, then we can choose a different algorithm. So the sweet spot is really when entropy is not very high. These are the key takeaways of the results. And another key takeaway from this paper, I think, is really to look more at the entropy of the distributions in different kinds of works, because it really matters. It matters to say whether the instances is going to be hard. And in our case, we can really explain the performance of the algorithm. And our information theoretic analysis generalizes to other classes of problems. It only relies on this notion of preference profile. So that might be applicable to other contexts beyond the competitive facility location problem. So coming back to, and I'm going to end on this slide, but coming back to the key points of the talk, I think these decision-dependent demand distributions are important for many classes of problems, but they're quite hard to deal with because of these distributions that change as we're searching over the solution space. And it also requires methods for better learning those models, but that's a separate topic. I do believe that these sample average approximations are good alternatives, but it's not possible to do them naively. We can't just, generate these sample average approximations and hope that we can solve those problems, because the problems just become unmanageable very fast. And we know that unless entropy is extremely low, we would need a very large number of scenarios to get high quality solutions. So I think for this particular problem, we could leverage the submodularity of the objective function and get an algorithm that is efficient. But entropy matters, so do look at entropies, and these are my key sort of messages of this presentation. I'm happy to take questions for the 5 remaining minutes. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much, Professor Freijinger, for your talk. So Sybil has a question. Oh, she is applauding.
I was clapping.
Okay. Okay.
Thank you.
Virtual clapping.
But now you need to ask a question still because you were clapping.
We are, if I have to, I think we are also implementing partial decomposition for a paper that we're currently working. I didn't know of partial decomposition, but we are exactly doing the same thing that you're doing with sample average approximation, and it does help. I mean, I don't know if it's a question or not, but just for the audience, perhaps to.
Okay, cool. Cool. So it does help for others. So what the class of problem are you solving? When does it help?
We are solving also a location problem, but with jointly with service network design decisions.
Okay, cool. Cool. I'll
That
check that out.
information, helps us converge faster in vendors for sure.
Awesome. Thank you.
Okay, so maybe I will ask some question while others are thinking about their questions. So my first question is your problem inspired by some practical application given that you are a chair and you are handling so many positions otherwise also? So is it supported through some case study or is it a theoretical problem that you have?
No, it's not theoretical. I usually start working on a more theoretical problem because I have a real one in mind, but just the scale of the real one doesn't allow me to sort of do the methodological work to solve it. So this one actually is really important for some of the problems that we have at the Canadian National Railway. So for the research chair that is funded by the Canadian National Railway, we do have a few without going into the exact details of those, but we have location or design decisions. So these are really closely related, right? Our location and design decisions. And these network design decisions are really driven by demand that is highly decision dependent in some cases. And so this is why we're trying to work on this. In my capacity as scientific advisor for this company, Vada Labs, we're seeing a lot of like assortment and pricing problems. And we have this very strong decision dependence also in those problems. And that means that it becomes very hard to learn those decision-dependent distributions, especially because in historical data, oftentimes we have observed very little on the support of these decisions, right? The decisions can be kind of static. They had always the same network design, or they always had the same kind of pricing, more or less, or like the same kind of assortments or whatever, right? So essentially for this decision-dependent distribution, it means that you have very little data to no data to understand how that will shift when you're changing your distributions, which leads to very interesting learning problems, but also very hard optimization problems because we want to generalize across these, right? And so these facility location problems that I'm talking about have also very clear connections to these assortment problems. And so that's why I chose to work on this one. They become a lot more challenging if you have capacity constraints. And one of this submodularity of the objective that we're looking at, we lose it if we have like different weights depending on, let's say, an assortment, if you have different pricing and such. So this is just one step towards more complicated problems. And this is why we started off here. But yes, I do see the high value of these, but we're not yet there with the methodologies to be able to solve those real world problems.
Thank you. I think it was a very nice work and very nice presentation. I will just conclude with a related question is that you are looking at utilities in your model, and sometimes, utilities, unless assumed as known, are very difficult and they change over time. They themselves are time dependent and subject to available alternatives in the market. So do you have any comment on this as if utilities are known and fixed, and what if they are not known with certainty? Then is it part of your problem?
Yes, it is part of the problem in the sense that we are not making any assumption about the distributions of those utilities. We're just, representing the features and the preference parameters as random vectors. And then we have these random terms which would represent everything we don't know. And we're not making any specific distributional assumptions on those, right? So this is, I think, the beauty of this, because you do need to have models that are updated over time, and it relates to really how you're learning those models and whether, you know, how these change as information is being revealed. So in this work, that was sort of the core premise, that we did not want to say that this is going to be a logit model or this is going to be a specific model. So yes, we do take that into account. The question on market changes, like new alternatives, is a trickier one, I would say, because we do need some information about the support of these distributions. So I'm not sure, like, other than treating these as scenarios, how we would deal with that. But yeah.
So are there any other questions from the audience? If not, then
I have one question,
Okay,
Anjali.
okay, please.
Not scientific though. I was wondering, what are the medals behind your back, Anna? There are tons of medals. Are those all yours?
Professor Nagurney, you have so many medals behind at your back. You can.
Wait a minute. Oh, it's my daughter's figure skating medals.
Well, congratulations.
I'm at one of the standing desks. I like to stand. So I moved. I got caught, huh? But I was always online, okay, even in moving. Very observant. Usually men notice that. It's funny.
Yeah.
Say, oh, all those men. Yeah, it's really interesting. So,
We are admiring.
And thank
yeah,
you
she's
both.
no longer figure skating, she coached, but she got a PhD in STEM, so I'm happy.
Oh, that's
So
a big achievement, both.
And that's like graduation caps for a PhD, kind of.
Congratulations. Thank you for excellent
Thank you.
presentations.
Thank you.
Really nice.
If there are no more questions, we applaud the speakers for their time and their presence. It was so informative, and look forward to meeting with you or listening to you at another point of time in future. Have a great day.
Thank you for organizing. Thanks for the
Thank you.
participation.
Yeah,
best.
thank you.
Thank
Take
you,
care.
everybody. And
Take
thanks
care.
for
Have a great
participating.
weekend, everyone. Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye, Emma.
Bye.